So our first big finding is that about half of the students who enter kindergarten as English learners were reclassified within 4 years. So what this graph shows is if you look along the bottom, this shows each year that students are entered. So this is students entering in kindergarten, and this is the probability of their reclassification, which you can think of as the percent of students who are reclassified. So in the beginning of kindergarten, none of them are reclassified. By the end of kindergarten, about 11%. By the end of first grade, close to 30%. By the end of second grade, close to 40%. And then by the end of third grade, or after 4 years, we've got a majority of students, a little more than half of the students. What that means is that we can think about, and this red line shows you where half of the students have become reclassified. This helps us understand that for an average student, or your sort of typical or median student, it takes about 4 years for them to become reclassified as English proficient. After that, different groups of students continue to be reclassified at rates sort of going on upward. Our second major finding was that the grade at which students entered seemed to matter quite a bit. It was very predictive of how long it took students to become reclassified. So in kindergarten, as I mentioned, it's about almost 4 years on average. In first grade and second grade, that's actually a little bit quicker. So we see students who are entering in these two grades actually are reclassifying in closer to 3 years. As we move later in the grades, as you might expect, students take longer and longer to become reclassified. So that in particular, students entering in grade 6 or grade 7 are taking almost 5 years to become reclassified. This matters for a couple of reasons. I think one reason it matters is because as we might expect, the age at which a student starts to learn a second language might have something to do with what they're learning in that language. And part of that is just, as many people might think, well, it's easier for young children to learn a second language quicker than older children. And that's true to an extent, although there's some research that suggests it's less true than we may think it is. But the other issue is that English proficiency is a moving target. So to become proficient in 6th or 7th grade, you have to reach a much sort of higher level of English proficiency than the kind of proficiency we're asking kindergartners or first graders to reach. Particularly given that, as in all states in the US, New York's assessment for English language proficiency includes reading and writing, not just speaking and listening. We have pretty high expectations in the later grades for the kinds of things that English learners are supposed to be able to read and write before they become proficient or before they become reclassified. Another thing I would say about this that's interesting is it does suggest that for our students who are entering in these later grades, in 5th, 6th, 7th grade, they certainly need to, they may need some more targeted supports, and they may need some more extra assistance in order for them to become reclassified more quickly. And this is a pattern that I don't think is just true of New York City, but is true more broadly speaking, that we may need some more targeted interventions to really accelerate the growth of students who are entering in later grades. Another main finding is maybe a little bit more what you might expect, that students with lower initial English proficiency take longer to become reclassified. So that students who entered with more what we call below average English proficiency, so these are students who have pretty limited English or not scoring very well on the initial test. They take about 5 years. Students, again, with average is about 4 years. And then students with above average who are closer to that proficiency level are taking about 3 years to become reclassified. I don't think this is too surprising. And those of you who work in schools, probably this doesn't seem that surprising. But it is a feature that I think in the past has been sort of ignored by some of our policies and by some of our accountability systems. Fortunately, with ESSA, this is actually just this week, the U.S. Department of Education released their final regulations around ESSA plans that states will have to complete. And one of the requirements is actually that as states measure progress in English English proficiency, that they need to take into account students' initial English proficiency, so that they set somewhat different expectations for students. We don't expect students who come in with very limited English proficiency to become proficient at the same rate that students who entered who are much closer to the bar for English proficiency. Then our final finding is that students with disabilities took longer to become reclassified. So here, if we look at students without disabilities, they're taking between 3 and 4 years. Students with specific learning disabilities are taking between 7 and 8 years. And students with speech or language impairments are taking about 5.5 or 6 years on average. So again, this is on average. So some students, even within each of these groups, are going to be reclassified more quickly than others. Some are going to take longer than others. But all of this is important to sort of keep in mind in thinking about our English learners with disabilities. This is a feature that we certainly need to also think about as we're sort of setting expectations and thinking through time to reclassification. I want to be clear, though, that this doesn't necessarily mean that it's not straightforward how to interpret this as either that the disability was preventing them from becoming English proficient, or that, on the other hand, maybe being in ESL or being in bilingual programs made it more difficult for these students to overcome their challenges with their disability. I think neither of those are straightforward. What we do know is that students with disabilities do take a bit longer to become reclassified. So these implications I've already essentially mentioned, but as you might have heard and might expect, developing academic English proficiency is a long-term process. It takes often many more years than we might expect or assume. That the time it takes students to become reclassified differs based on the tests, based on their characteristics, but also on the tests and criteria used. So one thing we found was that these times to reclassification in New York City are a bit different than times that we found in other states. Estimates out of California, often students are taking more like 5 to 8 years to become reclassified. And that's in part because the tests and criteria used are different. We also found that these times of reclassification are a little bit longer than times of reclassification in New York City in earlier decades. So there was a research study that was conducted primarily before No Child Left Behind, when their tests and criteria were different, and they were finding also different times of reclassification. So it suggests that the tests and criteria used are really important. And then finally, for folks working in schools, it suggests that some English learners may need some extra supports, and particularly students who enter with lower English proficiency, who enter in these later grades, particularly 6 and 7, or English learner students identified with specific learning disabilities or speech and language impairments.